I want to introduce them and open this session and this lecture as quickly as possible and get out of your way. But I do want to give some introduction to the speakers. It's a sort of a celebration, in a sense, of 3 years of Stephen Coleman being at the OII. I think the best tribute we can give is a serious discussion of a main topic of Stephen's. First, you can see Vicki Nash could hardly get all the sponsors on the page, but I'd like to thank all the various sponsors of this event. To remind people who don't know, it's a joint event. It's co-organized by the Berkman Center at the Harvard Law School and the Oxford Internet Institute. We have a number of collaborative events going on with Berkman in the next several days, and we're really delighted to have that kind of a relationship with another Center for Internet Studies and Society. We're also very delighted that we had the support of the Cisco Corporation, Cisco UK, and I see Nick Finston is here. Nick Finston was here at the very instigation of a collaborative relationship between Cisco and the Oxford Internet Institute that led to the development of a research program on e-democracy, and then to the recruitment of a visiting professor, the Cisco visiting professor of e-democracy. So we thank Cisco and eBay, another sponsor, and Omidyar Network, which was established by the founder of eBay and his wife Pam. So that we're delighted to have that kind of sponsorship, and of course the support of the Higher Education Funding Council that's made this possible. I guess another, it's not a sponsor, but another honor of today is that we have a very special guest, Jay Blumler, who's just arrived. J.G. Blumler, as I should say. He'd always correct me. He'd say, put the G in his publication. But he's emeritus professor of political communication at the University of Leeds. He was also at the University of Maryland. He was at the University of Southern California, a variety of places. He was formerly at Leeds the director of what was called the Center for Television Research, and it's now the Institute for Communication Studies, I believe I have the name right. His whole career of writing over decades has been focused on the press, media, television, of course, but all new media, and he was very interested in the new media and its implications for the public interest. So we have a person who's devoted his career to some of the topics that Stephen Coleman and others will be talking about today. He's just recently gotten a Career Achievement Award from the American Political Science Association, the Political Communications Division, which is so well warranted. And he's been a mentor to, certainly I regard him as one of my mentors, and I think he's been a mentor to Stephen Coleman and many others. So we congratulate Jay Blumler on his honor and thank him for honoring Stephen Coleman today. I'll be very brief. You know Stephen and you know many of the others, and you've seen the website, but Stephen Coleman is our Cisco visiting professor of e-democracy. He was formerly at the Hansard Society, where he directed a e-democracy program there. I first heard about him when I came to Britain after I had directed the PIC program. People said, have you met this fellow Stephen Coleman? He's talking about e-democracy and so forth. And then, of course, that was the history of, from then on, I kept hearing people from not just academia, but from industry coming up. Have you met this Stephen Coleman who's speaking about e-democracy and consultative forms of government, and people from industry, from business, from government, and from academia. He's one of these people who's become a center of a network of people seriously interested in democratic institutions and processes, and how the internet and related information technologies may support or undermine those processes. And it's epitomized the kind of cross-disciplinary, cross-industry kind of communication the OI tries to foster. He's the very first professor that we brought on to the OII within a few months of the establishment of me coming to the OII in the summer of 2002. And a few months later, we had a search committee together and actually brought Stephen on 3 years ago. He was brought on for 2 years as a visiting professor, and it was extended for a third year to the maximum length of time a visiting professor can be at Oxford University. And I'm absolutely delighted that he will, that he has a wonderful position, not just at any position, but at the Institute of Communication Studies, where Jay founded, I would think, is in terms of founding media studies at the University of Leeds. So he'll be going to the University of Leeds as in a professorial chair. And we're very happy for him, although we have mixed emotions about this because he'll be leaving the OII. And he's been an absolutely foundational character of the development of the first 3 years of the OII. And much of any profile we have in industry, business, academia is in large part due to Stephen Coleman. And so we're going to hear from him, and I'll stop this introduction, but I do want to say a bit. He'll be followed, he'll speak for 45 minutes. We'll have two 15-minute responses from first Alex Allan, who's permanent secretary of the Department of Constitutional Affairs from August of 2004. He was, I think, most notable in terms of the OII is that he was the first e-envoy, I think, in the UK. In 1999, he served in that capacity. And then before that, he was British High Commissioner to Australia and Principal Private Secretary to two Prime Ministers, both Tony Blair and, before that, John Major. And then Zephyr Teachout from the other side of the Atlantic will be talking, also involved in political communications in a variety of ways. She's a research fellow at the Berkman Center, also teaches at the University of Vermont. She's a public interest lawyer. Maybe you don't call yourself that. The older days we would say that. Maybe a public advocate. She has a law degree and an MA from Duke University, editor of the Duke University Law Journal. And I guess maybe most notable is director of the online organizing for Howard Dean's campaign, which was probably one of the most notable and significant internet-based campaigns in the US, certainly, and maybe around the world. And so we have a topic that when I first got an email that said, what about this topic of copper wire and electricity? It was in the heading copper wire and electricity. I thought it was spam, and I almost deleted it. And but the e-participation and power, and it's a clever title, and it's not just a clever title, it actually captures in a nice communicative way exactly some of the themes of Stephen's talk, where he's trying to get away from the sort of endless debate between top-down versus bottom-up e-democracy, and show us some new models. So Stephen, please.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Bill. I have several thanks to express before I can launch into the substance of my lecture. First of all, to the Oxford Internet Institute for putting up with me, for leaving me alone and letting me get on with things, for providing me with a remarkable group of colleagues, academics, administrators, research students. I regard them all as friends, and I will continue to pester them virtually and in person for years to come. Secondly, to Cisco for making my time here possible. Cisco has played an exemplary role over the past 3 years, offering me real support, encouragement, a formidable network of global connections, while never once seeking to influence my research agenda or my judgment. In particular, Nick Penston has been a good friend as well as a consistent supporter during these years. Thirdly, I'm indebted to my wife, Bernadette, who has been generous enough to combine her own prodigious professional and intellectual commitments with ceaseless support for my work, which has taken me all too often away from Oxford and away from her to over 40 countries I worked out over a period that I've been here. So moving to Yorkshire is sort of a madness with a bit of method in it. Finally, I want to express my thanks to our honoured guest, Jay Blumler, who is living proof that generosity of spirit is not an impediment to academic success. It's been a huge privilege to work with Jay on some of the ideas that I'll be discussing this evening, and which are elaborated in our forthcoming book on the internet and democracy. And it will also be my pleasure to follow Bill, reluctantly leaving the OII, to the environment of Leeds. Well, I have spent most of my time at the OII thinking about the relationship between ordinary citizens and institutions of political and social power. This thinking has led me to ask questions about how the public makes its presence felt in a democratic society which is very often complex, unequal, sometimes unjust, and how new technologies of digital mediation might have a potential to enrich democracy by closing the gap between those who expect to be listened to always and those who generally expect to be ignored. Asking these questions has given me cause to reflect upon the concept of power, what it is, and how it both shapes and is shaped by social communication. Now, I'll have more to say about power a little later, but by way of introduction and explanation of the cryptic subtitle of this lecture, I want to share with you a comment made by Enoch Powell, somebody I don't spend a great deal of time quoting, when he was being interrogated by an interviewer about where political power really resides in Britain. Is it in Parliament? Is it in the Cabinet Room? Is it in Brussels? Is it in Wall Street? The mistake you're making, said Powell, is that you're looking for the copper wire when you should be looking for the electricity. And I think he was right. Structures tell us a lot about power, but they don't constitute power itself. They are the copper wire through which the current of power runs. Just as the source of entertainment cannot be found in the tubes and wires of a television set, and wealth cannot be found in the computers and daily rituals of the stock exchange, political power doesn't emanate from politicians, from governing institutions, or from constitutional codes. It runs through them. In a democracy, I want to suggest, political power emerges out of the ambiguous, awkward, and fluid relationship between those who speak for the public and those who are the public, and how that relationship evolves determines the ways in which institutions, technologies, political ideologies, and moral codes embody power. In the early 21st century, across most liberal democracies, emerging and advanced, there are pervasive anxieties about the quality of this relationship between citizens and those who claim to represent them. The litany of despair is well rehearsed. We've come to recite it rather like a dismal catechism. Turnout down, 4 out of 10 eligible voters didn't vote in the 2001 and 2005 general elections. Parties dying, only 2% of the British population belong to them, leaving them as sanctuaries for the elderly, obsessed, and unhealthily ambitious. News consumption declining, TV news audiences falling by 25% amongst under 45s between 1997 and 2003. Politicians distrusted almost as a default position, citizens uninterested, confused, otherwise engaged, youth alienated and bored. 63% of them didn't vote in the last election. The political responses to this malaise are as predictable as they are unimaginative. First of all, there is the politicians' response of blaming the public for their indolent apathy. The public really ought to know better, try harder. When I hear politicians speaking like that, I'm reminded of Bertolt Brecht's observation that perhaps the government ought to elect a new people. Second set of responses, exhort the public to join in. Politics is really fun, it's tremendous fun, it's more fun than you could ever possibly realise if only you come in. Look, politicians are even wearing shirts without ties. Next response, cajole the public. Make voting compulsorily. Fine them if they don't show an interest in the speeches that you're making. And then finally, perhaps as an act of desperation, perhaps as a half realisation of what should be said, connect with the public. But when politicians say they want to connect with the public, they tend to have in mind the London taxi driver whose idea of engaging the passengers in conversation is to pause every half an hour to see if they're still awake. So the problem of engaging the public in the affairs of government is not a new one. For ancient Greek society, participation was a moral obligation rather than an act of self-assertion. Recall the Periclean funeral oration. Our concern for private affairs is balanced by our involvement with the affairs of the city. Even people who are mostly occupied with their own business are extremely well informed on political matters. We do not simply regard a man who does not participate in the city's life as one who just minds his own business, but as one who is good for nothing. Whereas in ancient democracy, public participation was regarded as a civic obligation, in the 18th and 19th centuries, governments came to fear the crowd, the brutish multitude, the mob, and public participation was regarded as a seditious intrusion into the spheres of government. In the 20th century, as mass democracy came to be adopted as a liberal norm, the duty to engage took on a parsimonious and disempowering character. Consider Walter Lippmann writing about the future of democracy. We must abandon, he said, the notion that the people govern. Instead, we must adopt the theory that by their occasional mobilizations as a majority, people support or oppose the individuals who actually govern. Schumpeter put it more starkly, I quote, democracy does not mean and cannot mean that the people actually rule in any obvious sense of the terms people and rule. Democracy means only that the people have the opportunity of accepting or refusing the men who are to rule them. Citizens might be forgiven for regarding participation on such terms as neither stimulating nor empowering. And without the prospect of influencing power, why on earth should anyone participate in the political process except as an act of blind collusion with authority? So we return to the question of power. What is it and how can it be made vulnerable to a participatory public? The concept of power was most authoritatively defined by Weber as the capacity of individuals or groups to realise their will even against the resistance of others. Power in this sense is asymmetrical. It entails winners, losers, and ultimate imposition of dominant interests. Power turns politics into a zero-sum game, in which any gain of power on the part of X must entail a diminution of power at the disposal of Y. Now, I certainly don't want to abandon that rational, instrumental, competitive conception of political power. In some circumstances, it is highly descriptive. If you want to understand a general election campaign or who's going to win, I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. And interestingly, we had a rather postmodern moment yesterday when a Thatcher won the latter and somebody claiming to look like Blair won the former. Sometimes these things are helpful. But I want to suggest that there's more to power than a narrowly conceived will to dominate. The democratic construction of power entails a mutual search for one another by governments who claim to represent the public and publics who want to be represented on their own terms. Governments can only govern by claiming to speak for the public. So they have to search for the public and persuade them that they are speaking for them. Citizens are only prepared to be governed if they are convinced that governments are speaking on their behalf. So they have to do two things: tell governments what they want, and then to say on, when governments deviate from the script. As Claude Lefort has argued, power belongs to the individual or individuals who can speak on the public's behalf, or appear to speak on their behalf, who speak in the name of the people and give them their name. In this sense, political power is less about who can do what to whom than about how spaces are created in which governance can take place in the name of the public. But for most people, however much they participate, power remains elusive. Political institutions and processes appear to be remote, exclusive, and beyond public control. Increasingly, publics in liberal democracies are abandoning traditional forms of instrumental collective action and taking up expressive, effective forms of activism designed to demonstrate that they exist, that their voices count as much as anybody else's, that the state is not at liberty to operate as if they were invisible. And if we look at the most successful movements of the last half a century, the feminist movement, the environmental movement, the movements for gay and lesbian rights, movement by young people, these are all movements in which the power of visibility is a central area of contestation. So contemporary democratic power is conceived in terms of who gets to be seen, heard, and acknowledged with respect, rather than Laswell's rather reductive economism of who gets what, when, and how. But a pressing question, therefore, for contemporary democracy concerns how the public can make its presence felt in this contest for recognition. In a post-deferential culture, and we are in a post-deferential culture, it is the public's sense of its own unfelt presence, both at very local levels and globally, in the official political process and in daily relationships with authority, that fuels its hostility towards those who claim to speak in its name. In mass-mediated democracies, this battle to speak in the name of the public has tended to be fought out not in parliamentary chambers or party conferences, but in television studios and newspaper columns. The BBC's Today programme can be seen as a daily act of ventriloquism in which various actors claim that they are really speaking for the public. The politician was elected by the public, the journalist really understands the public is the dummy. But as J. Blumler has so ably and consistently argued, and I quote from him, communications as presently organised is sucking both the substance and spirit out of the politics it projects. And it's doing so for several reasons. First of all, because the mass media is very good at presenting politicians to the public, but very bad at presenting the public to politicians. Secondly, because the media has become cynical and grudging in its attitudes to democracy and to the public, which has led to a breakdown in public trust. Thirdly, because the media tends to sap the efficacy of the public, denying people's ability to really make changes for themselves. And fourthly, because of the narrowness of the political debate covered as politics in the media, which dismisses everyday questions of power as being marginal or irrelevant. And that is why I want to argue that the emergence of the internet has given rise to such extensive speculations and hopes, because it is another space for potential power. And the question to be asked is whether this new network of networks, to use Bill Dutton's excellent term, develops the potential to become a space in which the public can engage with the democratic process in meaningful and consequential ways. Now, there have been two common responses to that question. The first is to say all that we are seeing online is the replication and normalization of a political system that is already obsolete. For example, how much money has been spent over the last 3 years webcasting council meetings? Now, I'm not sure how many of you in this room last rushed home, dashing through the door and avoiding the drink that was offered to you so that you could catch the mayor's opening comments at the council webcast, but you look reasonably sane to me, and I don't suppose you did. MPs' websites, produced by politicians who for years had created leaflets with pictures of themselves and their families and their dogs, put them through people's letterboxes, known that they were going to be thrown away in the bin, then have a website and say, now we will put a picture of myself, my family, my dog, and it's online. Everybody will look at it, particularly young people. So I think that's one kind of line of response. That's what's happening. Second line of response is the tendency towards techno-populism, the tendency to see a new space which can transcend all of the difficulties and complexities of representation. Toffler argued famously that, I quote, spectacular advances in communication technology have undermined old political assumptions. The old objections to direct democracy are growing weaker at precisely the time that the objections to representative democracy are growing stronger. President Bill Clinton's former strategic advisor, Dick Morris, argued, I quote, that the internet offers a potential for direct democracy so profound that it may well transform not only our system of politics, but our very form of government. Bypassing national representatives and speaking directly to one another, the people of the world will use the internet increasingly to form a political unit for the future. Such prophecies, it seems to me, seek to dispense with the problem of power by constructing a fantasy of the collectively embodied public. We, the people, we have to remember, is an aspiration, not a descriptive account. And I want to argue that such embodiment is a fantasy precisely because the public is always and must always be a mediated entity, something that comes into being because citizenship is a relationship between strangers who do not share a common experience or a single will. So if, as I've been attempting to argue, the most fundamental challenge of contemporary political communication is to enable the public to find one another, to talk to one another, to speak for itself as a public, and to speak with credibility to those who claim to represent it, what role might the internet play in this? Well, there are at least three features of the new media ecology which suggest that there is vulnerable potential, Jay Blumner's phrase, for this to happen. The first is the existence, I think one doesn't have to talk about this speculatively, of a condition of information abundance. As Bruce Bimber has written, new means for elites to distribute and acquire information, new possibilities for citizens to identify and communicate with one another, changes the way that citizens interact with the news system. And the historical preservation of information, among other developments, contributes towards a state of information abundance in the political system. Let me give you an anecdotal example, but one that I think was very interesting. I was talking to some people at the BBC recently who say that they found themselves confronted by great uncertainty and confusion at the time of the Bradford riots a year ago. Why did this riot break out in Bradford and not in other cities? Why then and not at another time? They sent reporters into the area, they talked to politicians, they read the local press. The clue came when they went to the BBC website, which is called Where I Live, and looked at the forum for Bradford. On the Bradford forum, they found hundreds of messages going back months which provided a clear historical account of what was simmering in that place. Similarly, in Madrid, after the bomb and the government's attempt to beguile the public in relation to the bombing, the use of email, text messages, in order to spread around a counter-version, a counter-narrative of that event, became absolutely crucial. In this country, the establishment of a website called They Work For You, an alternative to Hansard. Actually, the first thing that Parliament did when this website was set up by the My Society people was to threaten to sue them. I was approached by one or two people in My Society about that and reminded them that that's exactly what they tried to do to Hansard when he first wrote an account of what was going on in Parliament. So this isn't a surprise. So here we have the spread of information that becomes available to people, relatively costless opportunities to choose. Second characteristic of the internet is the existence of a form of communicative interactivity which moves us beyond what Postman referred to as the one-way conversation of television. Audiences and publics start to change roles when they are using the internet. At one stage, one can become a receiver, a watcher of a website, somebody who's simply there to learn and find out, and at the next moment, the internet ecology is such that one can become a producer, a challenger, a questioner, a networker. During the last UK election, the existence on several websites of something that two or three of us in the Institute have written about, election graffiti, where people remixed official websites and official party publicity and turned it into what they wanted it to say, became, it seemed to me, a good example of how the interactive public is no longer simply a receiver of information, if indeed ever it was. The third characteristic of the internet is its capacity to produce and empower networks who had previously been fragmented and dispersed. In Castell's famous account of this, the most direct impact of information networks, he says, on social structure concerns power relationships. Historically, power was embedded in organizations and institutions organized around a hierarchy of centers. But networks dissolve centers, they disorganize hierarchy, and make materially impossible the exercise of hierarchical power without processing instructions in the network. A couple of examples of networks that I found remarkable in my research over the last few years. One of them is a group of women called netmums who grew tired at going to official health websites, local government websites, social work websites to find out how to look after their children, what services were available, who they could meet. So they created their own network, produced their own expertise, distributed it democratically. The BBC Action Network, set up over a year ago, I evaluated the first year of it, which created a network of people across Britain united by two simple questions. Am I the only person facing this problem? What have other people done about it? It's become, I think, a relatively successful campaign by the BBC in the direction of e-democracy, and I applaud it. But there are two ways in which all of this vulnerable potential of which I've spoken could be squandered. The first is the danger of the appropriation by government of the whole process, where governments will say, yes, information abundance, but look at our information. Yes, interactivity, but we're the ones you really ought to be talking to. Yes, networks, but make sure that we are in touch with those networks and in control of those networks. Such e-participation is open to the accusation of allowing the public to have their say, their few words, their little bit of action at the expense of their autonomy or ability to control their own agendas. At its most cynical, such pseudo-participation involves attempts by elites to manage, domesticate, and diffuse participatory energies, which, were they to develop autonomously, could become a threat to their power. But the second danger, the opposite danger that all of this faces, is of political marginalization. That networks of that what one gets out of all of this are networks of the disaffected and virtual talking shops. That what passes for grassroots online activism becomes disconnected, dispersed, and unable to embed itself in the central areas of policy formation and decision-making. So if, as I am arguing, top-down e-participation runs a risk of lacking credibility and grassroots e-participation faces a problem of lacking relevance, are there synergistic ways in which the democratic potential of digital information and communication technologies can be used to enhance public voices without them being absorbed or usurped? Well, I want here to come to the policy proposal. I want to suggest a policy response which thinks imaginatively about the internet as a public space for democracy. Hannah Arendt, you may recall, argued that before men begin to act, a definite space has to be secured and structure built where all subsequent actions could take place. Now, to speak of a political space is not to speak in terms of Euclidean geometry or Newtonian physics about a bounded place or about a stage on which historical action takes place. To speak of space here, and in this sense, is to speak about the dimension in which social relationships are experienced. And the search for one another, which entails representing ourselves and being represented by others, is essentially, I would argue, a search for democratic space, for sites in which publics can be identified and come to speak in their own name. So what democracy needs in the age of the internet, I would want to argue, is a trusted public space where the dispersed energies, self-articulations, and aspirations of citizens can be rehearsed in public within a process of ongoing feedback to the various levels and centres of governance, local, national, and increasingly transnational. Jay Blumler and I have referred to such a space as an online civic commons, and we've argued that it should be run by a publicly funded and democratically accountable agency which would be charged with eliciting, gathering and coordinating citizens' deliberations upon and reactions to problems faced and proposals issued by public bodies. It would be a space in two senses of the term. It would be, first of all, an accessible space, a common ground. And it would secondly be a space between the private sphere in which people feel isolated and unable to act, and the official government sphere in which people feel worried and uncertain. Now, I don't think, this is directed towards the Permanent Secretary, that this is necessarily a task for government on its own. As a policy, it calls for an imaginative coalition of governmental, parliamentary, media, and civic organisations. In short, it should put pressure on the copper wire of institutional fragmentation of a kind that democracy now calls for. So in conclusion, as I've argued in a recent IPPR paper on direct representation, if the internet is to help citizens to get closer to democracy, three things have to happen. And research can contribute to these three things. Firstly, democratic institutions and processes must become sensitized to the ways in which real people tell their stories and express their fears and desires. For most people, life is recorded in fragmented narrative rather than coherent speeches, in heartfelt values rather than ideological stances. Only through translation into this expressive vernacular can governance speak to humanity and learn from the people it claims to represent. So this calls for research in areas like digital storytelling. How do we enable people, not always in linear and rational ways, not always within the confines of formal deliberation, to tell their stories, to impart their local knowledge, their metis, as Scott calls it? How do we inspire and facilitate that? Secondly, a civic commons should not only empower those who think they've got something to say, but should actually empower those who don't think they've got something to say, who don't think anyone's going to listen to them, who don't think what they say is important, who don't think that there's a reason to make a noise. And this calls for research on how people use the internet in order to express themselves as citizens, how different groups are using the internet. And there's some very good work being done on this. Sonia Livingstone's work on how young people of different types are engaging in e-participation, and a rather depressing story of how essentially it's middle-class kids rather than the rest who are doing so. Sonia Lift's work on rural communities, and some of my own work on how audiences for popular culture and reality television are encountering the political sphere. We need to look at how the architecture of the internet can diminish selective exposure and encourage cross-cutting networks that break through the demographic and ideological divides. Thirdly, public interaction with the democratic process must be seen to have visible and tangible consequence, whether online or anywhere else. Citizens of a democracy do not want to be asked their opinions merely so that government can say it's asked them their opinion. They want to see an authentic relationship between speaking and being heard, input and output, touching the lever and seeing the wheel turn. Far too often, democratic consultation amounts to pedaling a bicycle that's nailed to the ground. So if e-democracy is to establish a significance in the world of policy and power, research is called for which evaluates empirically the extent to which the policy process is open to or resistant to public influence. And at the policy level, this calls for a constitutional recognition that public deliberation has a role to play in the policy and decision-making process at every level of governance. And it seems to me that local neighbourhood governance, as well as European policy making, are two different but relevant areas for experimentation in this field to take place. That's why I want to argue, in conclusion, that the most enduring impact of e-democracy, the legacy of e-democracy as an embryonic idea, may not simply be to connect the energy of the public to the appropriating impulses of the state, but to connect the copper wire of governance to the civically generated electricity of inclusive public discourse. Thank you.
Permanent Secretary. Would you like to go ahead? We're going to go right through the speaker and the two respondents. And I failed to say that it's being webcast, but the speakers knew that. But at the end of the two respondents, we'll stop the webcast and actually open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for your introduction, and thank you, Stephen, for, as always, a very stimulating and absolutely fascinating run over a very big canvas, one that's interested me and one in which Stephen and I have had several debates on over the years since I first met him when I was, as Bill said, the e-envoy. I was very struck, though, Bill mentioned a previous job when I was Principal Private Secretary to two Prime Ministers. And although Stephen rightly said that political power doesn't emanate from politicians, I had a fascinating experience of seeing power changing and the way the British system does that. In that in 1997, when there was the change of government, I was in Number 10. I had the experience of John Major walking out of Number 10 at 11 o'clock on the Friday morning after the election with his wife Norma, and me behind them. He made a brief speech to the press. He got in the Prime Minister's car. His wife Norma got on the other side. I got in the backup car 5 minutes off to Buckingham Palace, where he resigned, was driven away in another car. Tony Blair arrived, went up, was sworn in by the Queen. He gets in the Prime Minister's car. His wife Cherie gets in the other side. I get in the backup car. 5 minutes drive back to Downing Street. Tony and Cherie walk down the street shaking hands. I scoot round the back. And by 12:30, an hour after John Major had left, I'm opening the front door of Downing Street saying, "Welcome, Prime Minister," to Tony Blair. And that's how power changes so swiftly in our system. But after I was the envoy and after another brief sojourn in Australia, where walking my dog on the beach played a big part, and there's been a picture of my dog on my website for about 10 years, I'm ashamed to say, I moved to be the permanent secretary at the Department for Constitutional Affairs. And we've got a large role in democracy. Indeed, our strapline is justice, rights and democracy. And the department deals with, traditionally it grew out of the Lord Chancellor's department, so it deals with issues like the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. But it's been accumulating other issues, so it deals with devolution, with parliamentary reform, with electoral reform, with human rights and with freedom of information. And one of the first things I did after joining was to go and talk to the person who was my successor's successor as e-envoy. The titles have been changed, and say to him that he didn't seem to want to, he had a few people working on e-democracy, and would they like to transfer over to my department, because I thought, and I believe it's right, that e-democracy should be seen as part of the wider democratic agenda, and parceling it off as something that was just literally in an e-government focus was actually by now the wrong agenda, and so we've taken over that side of the business. One of our key concerns is democratic engagement, and Stephen rightly started off by highlighting some of the problems of participation, turnout at elections. The one thing I would say is I think there's a very real problem and one that needs to be addressed. It is actually quite a long-running problem. I mean, when people are asked, how interested are you in politics? I mean, the proportion who reply very or fairly has changed remarkably little. It was in 1973, 60% said they were very or fairly interested in politics. In 1991, it was 59%. In 2001, 59%. So the issue of how interested people are changes rather slowly. I mean, similarly, the issue of trust, which is one that, as you can imagine, always worries government ministers and politicians as they appear right down the bottom of the league table along with sort of tabloid journalists. Again, the question, would you generally trust these people to tell the truth, asked of a range of occupations? Government ministers 1983 was about 17%, 2003, 20%. So not probably statistically significant, but showing that the issue of trust is, again, a long-running one. I mean, there have been other more worrying changes. Turnout is been in decline, though again, interestingly, it's in decline in most other democracies. And membership of political parties, as Stephen said, has tumbled to a level that makes, you know, the future of how we organize our political process open to question. There clearly aren't any simple answers to this. Within the department dealing with some of the issues to do with electoral reform, I mean, clearly we are doing some what I would characterize as small but worthy steps. There have been a number of experiments of voting pilots, trying to see what it is that will encourage people to vote more. Is it what makes easier to vote? And all postal pilots have actually proved quite successful on a small scale. And we've got some interesting debates going on with the Electoral Commission about what's the right balance between security and participation when it comes to registration, voting, postal voting, and so on. And there are some serious issues about targeting particular groups of people, particularly young people, because there is a fair amount of evidence that if people don't get engaged early, they may never get engaged. So the low participation rate among young people is a particular worry. Stephen then went on, and it's an area that, as I said, I have been very interested in, about the way that politicians see the political battles as being fought out in TV studios and newspaper columns, and the way that they have until relatively recently ignored the news space of the internet. And that's something, when I was e-envoy, I was particularly charged with promoting and trying to work what might be done. And I very much recognize what Stephen said about the initial response being to replicate what people had done through other means, and then at the same time to head off into techno-fantasies about what the new technologies might enable. But I do agree that governments have been rather slow to recognise the real potential, and that has let others leap into this space. And we've seen it through anti-globalisation protesters at G8 summits, where organisation via the internet is been a key part of it. We've seen it, as Stephen said, in issues like Bradford, Madrid. We've also seen it in some of the very important areas, like the setting up of a whole lot of sites like They Work For You, that actually have really stepped into a space that others should have occupied in some ways. And I was interested in Stephen's anecdote about them. The first thing was that the Hansard threatened to sue them. It recalled to me a time when I was e-envoy and had to deal with the extremely arcane point of HMSO getting very worried about copyright in government press notices, which seems a bizarre concept. Equally, I think in terms of slowness, or in terms of sort of false experiments in these areas, was the way that people thought about how they should use the internet for consultation. And there were some examples, and one of the early ones was done through the e-envoy's office, which was setting up online forums, eventually called Citizen Space, that were, the idea, I think, was simply that if you put up these forums, people would come in and tell you all you wanted to know, and that was great. And clearly that didn't work. All that happened was random noise. There was no real feedback, and they didn't work well. At the same time, there have been some very interesting examples of where decisions have been altered. And my favourite example comes from some time ago, but it's a South Australian example, where the then minister, he was a minister for both information technology and privatisation, and he was considering whether the South Australian government should privatise the ports. And he set up a specific part of his online forum where he actually participated himself, asking the question, if we did privatise the ports, what would be the particular issues that concerned you? And was worried that most of the responses would be about selling off the family silver. Not a bit of it. The most overwhelming number of responses were to do with if you privatise the ports, can I still go fishing off the end of the piers? And what was really remarkable about that was when the government did come to take its decision, of course, one of the things it was able to respond to immediately was, yes, of course, you know, you will have an inalienable right to fish off the end of the piers. And it may sound trivial, but that's exactly the sort of issue where governments can fall flat on their faces by not actually recognising what it is that concerns real people. But I mean, work has moved on a lot on in terms of actually developing how consultation via online forums can work. And I mean, one particular example that I commend very much was one that Stephen ran at the Hansard Society on the Forum for Victims of Domestic Violence, where by getting a carefully screened group of women who had suffered from domestic violence and others in a space where people felt able to communicate freely, achieved the sort of contact, feedback, communication that I really don't believe could have been obtained in any other way. In terms of where the government's going on this, I think one thing that I would highlight is that consultations and participation via the internet is one part of what I think still needs to be a multi-channel approach. We've done a fair amount in government through issues like the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister and the National Project for Local E-Democracy, which, despite what Stephen said about webcasts of council meetings, has actually developed quite a number of innovative projects among individual local authorities. But looking more widely, for example, I think one of the really innovative areas where the government has developed its process of consultation is actually in the field of health. And the most recent example was a big consultation exercise called Your Health, Your Care, Your Say, which has been running this year, which included online consultations, included a lot of staff events, stakeholder events, but also included a large number of events for people to gather together physically and exchange views. There were 4 lead-up events in Gateshead, Leicester, London and Plymouth, and then a citizens' summit in Birmingham at the end of October this year, where nearly 1,000 people came together to talk about the future of community health and social care. And the government will publish its white paper in January, I believe, and it's clear that the feedback they got from those consultations is a key part of shaping and developing the proposals. As I say, e-consultation, e-democracy, I think will clearly play a part in that. I think the hard area for governments in this is actually the way that technology is changing. And I think one way technology is changing through what's happening through television and, you know, at long last, more sense of convergence, something that got talked about but never delivered for a long time, through the developments of the way people watch television through Sky Plus or TiVos, will actually mean that it's less and less relevant for politicians to believe that they can simply go on a news programme and communicate to lots of people through that. And I think they're beginning to recognise that, but there's a long way to go. Equally, at the same time, trying to make use of new technologies, I think there's great dangers that they can go the same way on issues like blogs as they may have done originally on websites, and the idea that every politician just writes a blog and everybody will listen to them and that's communication is no more right than the idea that putting up a website with a picture of their wife and dog was a way of communicating. But nonetheless, it's clear that trying to tap in to the innovation on the internet is a really important part of trying to work out how best to communicate. So I'm very keen for the government to tap into new ways of communicating, to actually building up participation through really listening to people. I am, though, very wary of the government trying to do too much to shape this. I think the proposal for an online civic commons is a really interesting one, but I was very glad to hear Stephen say that he wasn't expecting me to go away and set this up, and that it required a coalition of a wide variety of stakeholders actually to come together with enthusiasm to set it up. And I believe that is absolutely the right way to go. If government tries to impose it on people, it simply will languish in a way that other attempts like this have done. So, I mean, in conclusion, I believe governments really do need to listen more. Communication is a two-way process. The government has set up a new unit in the centre and a new permanent secretary for government communications, a job that I was quite interested in before I got my current job. And I'm a strong believer, as is Howell James, who holds that job, that the internet's got a key role to play in that. But I think it has to be part of a wider move to recharge democracy and make people want to participate because they feel that their voice is heard and that they are making a difference. I believe that's possible, and I believe the internet has a huge role to play in that. Thank you.
I tend to bring a normative perspective to everything. The second is as an American. And the third is I've recently started teaching internet and politics, and I'm so thankful for Stephen's work. My students asked me when preparing for the final exam, why is there so much Coleman? Well, you need to know everything he's written, because what he's written is really seminal and really important for framing the conversation, for thinking about different kinds of ways of understanding e-democracy. And as an American, I want to mention that in our country in the 19th century, there was a rule that every citizen had to live, a rule of thumb, every citizen had to live within a day's buggy ride of a county seat. So there was this physical, the geography was a real proxy for power. And I think it's appropriate that now we're using the metaphor, thinking about using the internet, and Stephen's real metaphor of the physical architecture of the internet is also a way of understanding the proxy for power, thinking about power. I'm really delighted he's framing it in terms of power. If we're stuck inside political language, we end up only looking at political power compared to other political power. So Latvia compared to Lithuania, or in the States, North Carolina's use of the internet compared to South Carolina's use of the internet. Britain's really remarkable, compared to the US, use of consultations compared to the US use of consultations. But if you look at power and take away the language of politics, you have a different perspective. I tend to look right now at this moment that we're in as having three ascendant forces in the world. Not in terms of mass, but in terms of power. The first is multinational corporations. The second is radical theocracy or theocracy. And the third is civic democracy. I tend to be in favor of the third and believe that of these three ascendant forces, it may be that whichever one really figures out how to use the networking power of the internet can define the future of the world for the next couple centuries. It's a crude form, but it's a way to think about this. Looking sort of examples of those, within radical theocracy, we see Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda has the advantage of growing up in an internet era, not only using the internet for organizing and for sharing memes and theologies, but also growing up in an era where the culture of the internet is so central, a culture of decentralization. So it is a movement that grows with the internet and I think can be so powerful and so terrifyingly powerful because of that. You also see in the States churches being structured in a way that they can take advantage of the networking power of the internet much easier than a lot of other institutions like state governments or schools. The churches have a network at their core. Traveling ministers connect churches to each other. And you see growing uses of the internet in churches like the Saddleback Church and others for creating small cellular structures. For multinational corporations, it's much cruder. I'd say that Al-Qaeda and the churches are still ahead in some way in this race. But multinational corporations, you see groups like, or you see companies like Harrah's, the casino, which has something like 20 times the number of email addresses that George Bush does. In a country which is paranoid about sharing information, we share enormous amounts of information with corporations who then use that information to develop strong loyalties. There's an extraordinary center of power there and a focus on using technology. Corporations are much more flexible than states, especially states that have been around for a long time, in exploiting technology. And then we have civic democracy. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the Ukraine and other examples of places which have really used the internet to enable civic democracy. And in our country, Stephen in other writing has I think rightly, recalled us to core questions of what is democracy. That if we're going to be engaged in this question of how do we want to use the internet, we should also engage in the question of what kind of democracy do we want. The American tradition is quite different. Civic democracy has always been really dependent on extra-governmental voluntary associations. Think the Parent-Teachers Association, the PTA, the Knights of Pythias. There was a commentator in the late 1890s who said that the great safety valve of American democracy was that we were a nation of presidents. Everybody was a president of something. And in Theda Skocpol's great recent book, she documented this, finding that 1 in 20 Americans at any given time in the early 1920s was a president of a local voluntary association like the PTA or the Knights of Pythias. So there was a culture of power, a culture of people being in power. Sidney Verba did a cross-national study a couple times, redid it looking at satisfaction, trust in government, and a sense of power in Western European countries and the States, and found that engagement in voluntary civic associations was actually really critical to people's sense of power and to their happiness and to their sense they lived in a democracy. These have fallen apart in the past 50 years. Whether or not the trust numbers in this state in Britain have declined rapidly, the number of people who are a member of voluntary civic associations in the state has basically been gutted. And coming from this history where power was a real personal habit for a large portion of the population, I see the internet as having extraordinary possibilities in recreating that personal habit of power, but not necessarily doing it through governmental associations. So this is the grassroots versus governmental question that you were talking about. In my recent experience, we've seen the internet used. Sort of Stephen's comments about the limited way in which it's been used so far is really striking. I think of two people fighting in campaigns. People have been fighting with sticks for 100 years, and somebody finally gives one of them a gun, and they start beating up the other person with the gun because they don't know that it shoots. And I sort of have that sense sometimes looking at the use of the internet in campaigns in the United States. But to give a sort of range of this, 2004 was really the first year that the internet was used really aggressively in presidential campaigns in the States. I was involved in the Dean campaign. We were very focused on creating decentralized power where people could create and be part of creating their own campaign. Jonathan Zittrain talks about this as sort of the generative capacity of the internet in arts and in other areas. I like thinking about this as sort of generative politics, that we were focused on enabling a structure where people could come up with their own ideas, be it something as simple as using business cards instead of flyers to share ideas, or creative ideas like going to the ballpark and doing politicking at a ballpark, stuff that hadn't been done for a long time. While we did that, and after we fell out of the sky, having shot the gun in the wrong direction, other campaigns were much more focused on using the internet as a list-building tool, basically taking what they knew from broadcast media, from television, and build as big a list as possible. And so far, we've still seen that. There isn't this moment. There's little examples. There's Music for America or Downtown for Democracy, these tiny federated structures. But the bulk of the sort of post-2004 and 2004 campaign has been focused around using the internet as a crude feedback tool at best and broadcast tool at worst, not a tool which gives people true power in the sense that Stephen talks about. So the places that I would look for models then is not politics. It's not even, you look at Estonia, and Stephen's done some great work at sort of laying out the beginnings of comparative research. But looking at governance, not within governments, but Wikipedia or Linux or Second Life, that there are actually organizations that are figuring out power relations in really innovative ways using the internet, but they tend not to be within the traditional calcified political structure. So along with the research that Stephen suggests, I would also sort of take where he's going and then and even broaden the debate to look at power in its broadest sense. But thank you for the great paper and the opportunity to teach it.
That's the end of the webcast.